and welcome to Rotted Review of the Day. And today I am doing something a little bit special, something I've never done before, and I'm diving straight from one franchise into another. We just finished with the Halloween franchise, going through every single movie released thus far, and I decided that I want to continue on with this for just a little while longer, and I want to do something a little bit less well known. Enter something that I think should be on everybody's radar. If you are a horror movie lover, especially a lover of Asian horror, then this series is absolutely worth watching, if for no other reason than historical, cultural relevance. So, what I will be tackling is the Whispering Corridors series, and if you've never heard of it before, what this is basically up until the early mid-90s, Korea had very, very strong censorship laws. If a movie was trying to be made that depicted anything about societal life, government, school, anything about that was in less than a favorable light, it was simply not allowed. You could not make those movies. And until the earlier mid-90s. And those censorship laws got lifted. There's all sorts of reasons behind it, but long story short, Whispering Corridors was the first film, and it was made in 1998, that really stretched those boundaries to a popular degree and set in motion what would ultimately become the stage of one of the best countries for horror. I'm talking about K-horror, South Korean horror. It's just some of the most phenomenal stuff out there. If you like things, like especially revenge horror, oh my lord. And this is the genesis of that. This is the first movie that really took off and allowed this to happen. It really stretched those limits, and that's something that I want to cover. So that's what I'm going to do. There's 5 films in this series. They're very, very loose association with each other. There's no character bleed over, no storyline bleed over. The only real consistent theme throughout them is that they all take place, as far as I know, I haven't seen all of them yet, but they all take place within a all-girls school. Not necessarily the same school, just an all-girls school. But it's a little bit like the seasons of True Detective. There's an overall thematic tie-in, but for the most part, with every incarnation, it's a full wipe and reset. So this review is going to be of the first movie, the 1998 movie Whispering Corridors, the one that started it all. And just to remind everybody before I really begin with this review in earnest, cultural relevance of this film is something that is absolutely near and dear to my heart, and it will always hold a special place in my heart because of that. However, when it comes to scoring, it does not factor into it. The scoring system is objective, it is universal, and it strictly gauges how I feel about the movie as it's presented to me while it's on the screen. So, Whispering Corridors. This movie starts out with, in a all-girls school, and it starts out introducing the character of Mrs. Park. And we don't get introduced to Mrs. Park for very long before she winds up dead in what appears to be a suicide that is assisted by a spirit of some sort. She makes a phone call. She's clearly scared about something. It looks like she's getting attacked by something, and then she winds up hanging by the neck from the school. And that's where the students find her. And then we get kind of introduced to what I would say are kind of our 2 main characters of Jio Lim, who is an aspiring painter, kind of an odd character, in this very slight way, still kind of popular, still kind of fun, but it has some eccentricities about her, daughter of a fortune teller, things like that, as well as Jae Yi-yoon, and she is just this very, very shy, very introverted girl that Jio kind of takes under her wing, and they become friends, especially as situations within the school become more tense, and they do. With the death of Mrs. Park, a new teacher, a substitute teacher in the form of the school's principal, I believe, Kwang Yu-oh, who they call Mad Dog, takes in to temporarily take over teaching responsibilities, and Mad Dog he is. Very strict, very authoritarian, very abusive, fully abusive even. And as things kind of come to a head and Mad Dog doesn't really care for the paintings that Jio does, Jai takes Jio under her wing and shows her this odd place, this kind of old storage room that used to be the class's art room, and that's where she can paint from now on. And things kind of take off from there. Really, what this is a very shining example of a movie that spins a very dramatic yarn in terms of a character developed story that manages to have horror elements bring out truths and storylines and character reveals in a way that just really ramps up the dramatic tension of the characters themselves. What I mean by that, I know that was a bit rambling, but what I mean by that is oftentimes in horror, whatever the spirits can do to us is not nearly as bad as what we can do to each other. And that is something that really gets brought out in this, that the horrific nature of what we are able to do to ourselves, the conflict of man versus man, is so much more terrifying and real and visceral and impactful. And this really hones in on that. This really has a lot more of the terrifying nature of what we are able to do to each other as a society, as a culture, as school children that are basically bullying one another, or teachers that are putting so much pressure on them that it leads to terrible consequences. And then whatever gets hidden, swept under the carpet, things like that, the spiritual aspect of this doesn't allow that to happen. It reveals through circumstances of, uncovering the mysteries, what actually happened, bringing the truths to light and showing us who we really are. And this is a fantastic job of that. It is a little bit rough around the edges. This is kind of, I guess, what I would say the cinematic equivalent of figuring out who you are. From the camera work to the cinematography, the sound design, all of it is just a little bit rough. They're still trying to figure out, in this world of open, the censorship being lifted, how much they can do, what they can do on a technical level, how to go about what they're doing. So it doesn't feel necessarily that polished or big budget, but it still has a very, very strong heart at the center of it. I'm going to go and throw up all the scores here. As always, 4 different categories, each one worth up to 25 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And I think all of it wound up in a place of above average, could have been better, not spectacular. And that's really genuinely how I felt about this movie, just strictly as it was for the hour and a half some odd that was on the screen. I really enjoyed the characters, I really enjoyed the plot, I really enjoyed the mysteries that were unfolding. None of it really knocked my socks off and blew me away, but it was enjoyable nonetheless. So from a plot level and an intent level, I thought it worked pretty well. Intent just a little bit less than it should have, only because I could see what they were trying to do with some of the scares. And I would say that although they were interesting as scares, they didn't really work that well. But also intending to be a very touching and moving character-driven story, I thought that it did succeed very, very well on that one. The acting I thought was done reasonably well. Nothing, again, spectacular, but everybody sold their performances, like I said, reasonably well. I really don't have any complaints about it necessarily. And as far as the technical goes, again, rough around the edges, nothing really that spectacular in terms of the camera work, but there was a lot of effort put into this, and there was a lot of editing choices that I thought were really good. There's so much potential for a movie like this to kind of get lost in its own mythos and winding up going down a rabbit hole that especially us as Western audiences might not be able to necessarily follow that well, especially when you're doing things like this movie did with time jumps back and forth. As it's revealing the past, it's showing the past, and it can be a little bit jarring, but I think on a technical level, from an editing point of view, they did a pretty good job with this one. And I'll also say on an effects level, there really wasn't a whole lot to be had here, but there was one scene at the very end that I thought was pulled off very well. Just from a visual standpoint, I really enjoyed the classroom at the end. That's all I'll say. I think that's spoiler free enough that the classroom at the end, I really, really like that. And also, just one thing I want to mention as far as the end goes, avoiding spoilers, the resolution. I'm going to keep this as spoiler free as possible. So I'm going to be very careful with my words here. But the resolution to the conflict of the spiritual nature was something that I thought was spectacular and something that we see far, far too little in horror films. The idea that, as far as having all of the options available to us in terms of spiritual, overcoming horrific spiritual aspects to it, be it aggressive or insightful or intelligent or pacifistic, is that a word? But regardless, the way that this managed to quell the demons and resolve the conflict, I thought was very, very well done. It could have been come across as extraordinarily schlocky. It's had very high ham potential to it, but it didn't. It treated it with reverence. It took the characters that it cared for and cultivated, and it put them in a good light. It managed to continue fostering that towards that resolution, and using that, managed to avoid that cheesiness that it really, really easily could have crossed that line into. So that's about all I'll say on the plot, all I'll say on the end. And actually, you know what? I think that should about wrap up this review. I would absolutely recommend this movie. If you are a horror movie lover, films like this are staples. They are bullet point moments in which the world of horror changed. As a culture, as a society, and as a world, this was Korea putting its foot firmly into our realm and showing us what they got. And it really, really managed to take off from there, and this was the starting point of it. And it's a good movie to boot. So the first film of the Whispering Corridor series, Whispering Corridors, I would absolutely recommend. It may not have earned a huge amount of points, but it's still a good movie to watch. So that should about do it. That's my review of 1998's Whispering Corridors. I really thank you for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe. And if you want to support me further, my Patreon $1 a month tip jar and my merchandise storefront links are below. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.